HTML and CSS3 have made some valuable contributions to our ability to write modern web pages and responsive web pages. Now there is less code to write because many of our semantic elements are used to replace commonly used ID attributes. However, you may still need to use a backward JavaScript file for older browsers. CSS3 has enabled faster download times because these properties replace things that we traditionally did with images. Older browsers will ignore them so nothing is broken. This is very useful for responsive design. So here on the left-hand side, we see a traditional div layout with classes, or they could be IDs, identifying those sections. On the right-hand side, we see some new HTML5 semantic elements, which give our elements more meaning. However, we can still use classes and IDs. Some terminology you should be familiar with. Progressive enhancement, which refers at this point to CSS, means that we start developing with a baseline style and layout that works well in all devices, and then we progressively add on the enhancements for the more recent browsers. That way, if the browser doesn't support it, nothing is broken. Responsive web design, which we'll be covering for approximately half of this class, means that we're providing a layout and functionality that responds to the device. It's not just a matter of changing the screen size. It's a matter of making sure that things are large enough to be clickable also. In this class, we will review some CSS syntax. We have CSS rules. A rule is a combination of a selector and a declaration. The selector is where the rule will be applied, and your mastery of CSS selectors is paramount in the web development field. A declaration is composed of a property and value. So here we see the body element as a selector, and the property color being set to the value of blue. You may need to use what are called vendor prefixes or browser prefixes. And that is temporary until the W3C ratifies the property and value. This may take a while, so you will be seeing a lot of instances where this is needed. In order to find out the latest CSS3 support, I recommend caniuse.com, and also to find out about browser statistics, gs.stackcounter.com is a good resource also. Alright, let us review basic selectors. An element selector means that the style will be applied to the element. So in the body section, I have an H2 element. Any styles applied to that element, selector, meaning the name of the element, or tag, will be applied to every instance in that page. We also have ID selectors. ID selectors should be used uniquely, meaning if I have an ID equals head, it is only allowed to be used once in that document, regardless of whether it works or not, because JavaScript also uses ID selectors. In the style sheet, we would represent that with a pound sign in front of the value of ID. We also have class selectors, which are called essentially in the HTML document by using the class attribute. The value that it is set to will be referred to in the style and preceded by a period. So wherever that class is called, those styles will apply. The nice thing about classes is that they can be reused throughout the entire document. You might see a syntax similar to this, where a class is directly related to an element. That means that that class is only valid for that element. It is not universal as in the previous slide. In the HTML document, we have what is called a parent-child descendant relationship and also a sibling relationship. Our HTML can be laid out as a document tree, similar to an ancestry tree, where you can find the parents, childs, and siblings. Rather than using IDs and classes, we can relate to different elements based on their document relationship, which we will see later. So we have what are called descendant selectors. You might also hear the term contextual selectors, meaning that in this certain context, the style will be applied. So if we look into the body, we have a div ID equals XYZ, and we have a UL, which is a child. If we wanted to apply a specific style to that UL and only the UL inside the div with ID equals XYZ, we could do that by creating a descendant selector. Descendant selectors are very powerful and widely used in the field because it enables us to zoom in on certain elements but not all of them, which would be the case if you were using an element selector. Now, this is a descendant selector. If you look at the body section, we have two ULs. We have our outer parent UL, and then the LI also contains a UL. So we have two descendants of ID equals XYZ. So this descendant relationship means that it will apply to any UL that is a descendant of XYZ, which might be fine depending on the situation. However, if we wanted to limit it to a direct child descendant, so that it only applies to the first UL, a direct child, not a grandchild, which is technically what the second UL would be, we can use that greater than sign in our selector syntax to indicate that that UL is a direct child. This is not that commonly used, but it's good to know. We also have what is called an adjacent sibling. So if we look in the body section here, we see the parent body, and we see three siblings because they are all essentially at the same level. If you wanted the direct sibling, the plus sign with the UL would indicate the direct one, not necessarily all of them. A general sibling would indicate all of the siblings. However, when we look at the descendant selectors or sibling selectors, the starting point is always, in this case, the ID, which means that it refers to the siblings after that ID, not on front of it. You can also group selectors by commas, and any combination of selectors can be used. Attribute selectors, which are not that commonly used, but here again, very powerful. If you look into the body section, we have the title attribute, which essentially gives a tooltip. Now, title attributes are used commonly in the image tag and in the ahref element. However, I am using them in the H2 for this demonstration. So what our selector says, H2 title, and there are no spaces, it means that every H2 that has a title attribute will be the selector, and the styles on the right will be applied. it does not matter what the value of the title attribute is. This example, the title attribute is directly tied into the H2. However, if it was sitting by itself, it would mean any title in any element. So be careful of that. We can further refine conditions for attribute selectors. If you look in the body section, we have two titles, attributes. Title equals welcome and title equals hello. In our CSS section, we have H2, title equals welcome. So this would be a match for the title that exactly whose value was welcome. Notice that it is case sensitive, so it would only apply to the first. We also have another variation on the attributes where we have a tilde in front of the equals. And that means that the value of the title attribute is contained somewhere in the string. So if you look at our HTML, here we have title equals welcome to, title equals hello and welcome. The word welcome is contained somewhere. So that would be a match, meaning the style would be applied. The asterisk means that the title will contain that string, not necessarily the word. So if we look in the body section, we have the string WEL in two different places. Therefore, that would be a match and the style would be applied. The caret means that that word is at the beginning of the value of the title attribute. So in this situation, we would only have one match because welcome only exists at the beginning in one instance. The $ indicates that that word would be at the end. So in this instance, we only have one H2 whose title has the word welcome at the end. The CSS3 column count property is a very nice property that can be used to transform one element into multiple columns. You can only use this for one element, and it's most commonly used for text. It is not really appropriate for page layout or for multiple images. How this works is we either have a column count or a column width property. If we use the column count, for example, set it to 2, it would determine how many columns. And as the screen or the area got bigger and smaller, they would just reflow. So that is more of a percentage variable, which works very well because it is responsive in nature. Now, column width would allow the optimal width of each column. So for example, if I set the column to say 100 pixels and I only had a small area, it would give me as many columns as I can at 100 pixels. However, if my area were to become larger, I could have more columns at 100 pixels. So both of these are basically responsive in nature. Optionally, you can set a gap, which is padding between the columns, or a rule, which essentially is a line, and the syntax is similar to a border. So here up top, we have 3 columns, and on the left-hand side, we have the CSS syntax. And notice that we are using vendor prefixes, and at this point you still need to use them. We are setting the column count, the column gap, and the column rule. Here again, the value for the rule is similar to the shorthand for a border or an outline property. On the right-hand side, here we see how the HTML might be laid out. The CSS3 word wrap property. It allows us to break a long word. Generally, you see this happening with long URLs. Therefore, this is highly useful in this responsive design. So if you notice on the left-hand side at the bottom of the last bullet item has an extremely long URL, which will stretch out the width. And on the right-hand side, we see that URL is now wrapped. It will still work properly. CSS Table Properties. You see them being used in the book, although the properties are not really discussed. This is the CSS display property. Some commonly used values are none and block, which we use in navigation a lot. However, if your HTML was coded in the proper order, you could actually use these properties to display your content in a table-like manner without violating any kind of rules, because tables are generally used for tabular data, not for page layout. So you actually could lay out your content in a table-like fashion using CSS. So here we see an example of how you might structure your HTML, and I'm using all divs. I have an outer div for the table. I have another div, which is where the row might be. I have two of them. And inside I have two other divs where we might have some cells. And if you were to run this and look at the CSS now, here we are applying the table value to the display property, which essentially tells the browser that this whole thing is a table. And the table hyphen row puts these two items into a row, and the table hyphen cell will put them into their individual cell positions. And we also have some additional styles there.